Well, good afternoon. Hi, I'm Gary Silberg, the Global Head of Automotive, and I am delighted to host all of you today for, you'll find out, a star-studded panel to talk about global supply chain, what's happening in our automotive industry. And I am honored and delighted to be joined with two esteemed panelists. First, I'll start off with Robert Burns. Robert is the Vice President of Human Resources Administration at Hyundai Motor Manufacturing in Alabama. It has over 3,000 employees there, and we're going to hear about him in many different facets because they, of course, were on the front line. I asked Robert something personal interesting about himself. So he is a DIY, a do-it-yourself guy. I said, well, so what does that mean? So he keeps his wife happy. Apparently, he can cook, he can fix things. He's the all-American boy here. So delighted to have you. And also with me today is Doug Murtha. Doug is the Group Vice President of Corporate Strategy and Planning at Toyota Motor Company. He's had incredible jobs within Toyota, from running Scion to different in the strategy and retail side of the business. But now he's in this corporate planning role, so we're going to hear some big picture things from him. I asked him what he likes to do, and he likes to ride that bike. I guess are you going to be a road racer sometime, Doug, or any big events on that coming up? All right. So with that, the way I'm going to, just a brief background on myself. As I said, I had the automotive industry for KPMG, and right now our industry, in my opinion, should be incredibly proud, really incredibly proud of what we have been able to accomplish during such a tumultuous time, and been leaders in the world in manufacturing and how important that was. And one of the areas, though, that as we watch through the pandemic and then going forward is this area of the supply chain. In our world, I have four strategic focuses that we're working on. One of that is called the Reimagining supply chain. And I want to go in depth with these two people because they're going to walk you through it. So the way I've outlined this, gentlemen, I want to talk through various different areas. Let's start more salient, and then we're going to go strategic, and we'll talk about different parts of the globe and bring it that way. So let's start off probably with the most salient topic, and that is semiconductors. Every day we're hearing about shortages. Now we have a fire in Japan with Renesas, I always pronounce that wrong, on the chip side. Maybe I'll start with you, Robert. You're on the front lines, maybe more short term. Tell us what your experience on semiconductors, how have you dealt with it, what are you doing, and enlighten us, if you would.
Yeah, what I'll point out is that when COVID struck last year in 2020, and we saw in Asia, meaning China and Korea, how there was a little bit more of a rebound than maybe some anticipated once some plants went down. So when we saw that, we decided as a company that we were going to continue to order parts, which yes, includes semiconductors, to be able to maintain our production when we got back up and running, specifically in North America, in early April of 2020. And that allowed us to have that supply in place. Has it been easy? No, I can't say it was a perfect situation. There's still challenges in front of us right now. But we look at it from a global scale, and the company was looking at which markets were performing well, whether lockdowns in Europe or maybe something going on in India, because we have plants in Brazil and India and Turkey and Russia. And so it was allocating based on where the demand was, which vehicles were the customers wanted. And that allowed us to kind of change our mix almost on a daily basis, even here at the plant, trying to make sure that we had the right vehicles based on the availability of the semiconductor. And again, we continue that even today.
Yeah, it's a tricky one for you. Have you seen any stoppages, or do you think just in your plant, or do you feel good for the near term? Because obviously there's big demand for vehicles now, and there's not enough supply. So any foreshadowing for us?
Right now, we've been able to manage the situation with our global purchasing team. Again, just that allocation based on the current demand. And there is risk there, so it's hard for me to say because it's almost a day-to-day situation. But we've been very successful at this point to manage through this. without any production downtime associated with the semiconductors.
Now that is bravo to you guys, because that is not, as you know, the case in the industry. In fact, it's been very difficult. So well done. Doug, let me go to you on this topic, even maybe bring it up a little bit higher from a strategic perspective. This is quite an important component to the vehicle. It will become more important. First of all, how does Toyota think about, from a strategy perspective, semiconductors? And then I want to probe a little bit more and go into different parts of where the semiconductor plays and get your perspective on that. But just let's start more macro, and how has it also impacted Toyota?
Sure. Yeah, I think there are two discussions in play right now. One is the longer term demand. As we all know, the role of semiconductors in vehicles has continued to grow, and so what ability do we have, and does that supply base have to keep up with the demands of our market? I think one of the things we run into, unfortunately, is relative to some of the consumer electronics, we're a small player in that space. So I think we have to work a little harder to get our needs recognized and get accommodated. But there is a longer term discussion on necessary capacity and on what demand we're going to have in the design of the vehicles going forward. I think the reason it's in the spotlight right now so much is obviously some of the short term disruptions, and Robert alluded to this, with the COVID declines in demand for a short period of time. I think, quite honestly, there were some errors in forecasting, maybe some within the supplier base itself, perhaps some within the industry, on just how quickly was the market going to respond and what was our demand going to look like. Beyond that, we've had a couple of fires with a couple of critical suppliers taking supply offline, and frankly, even with full supply, we wouldn't have had the headroom to really make up that shortage of capacity, or that misforecast in the middle of last year. So, I think similar to Robert's case, we did do some preemptive ordering. We had a relatively good supply or buffer stock, and so I think our impact relative to maybe some of the other competitors in the market has been less. But we have definitely we've lost some production, and we've had to make some trade-offs in terms of what we build, because as you might imagine, some of the same chips go into different vehicles. So where are you going to allocate that supply? What vehicles are going to get it? And then what other implications does that have for emissions compliance or trade or anything else, right? Kind of managing all the variables.
No, that's a great point on both of those. And who would have thunk, we've got all the demand for these devices, are pulling that, and these semiconductor companies have choices, right? And I want to probe this a little bit more, because I've talked to a lot of auto executives. One of the awesome things about our industry is we have Six Sigma quality. It's automotive grade. We are, and when Toyota orders something, or Hyundai orders something, or the other automakers, the suppliers really make an effort to make this world class. They have to have 10 years supply. There's very specific automotive grade requirements. And given that there's, I'll say 10 to 12 of you make up 80% of the production, if you will, of that, you wield incredible power, incredible buyer power, as we say in strategy or economics. But with semiconductors, you're pretty low or lower on the totem pole, and you can't demand like you can from other suppliers, because they're not captive to you. In fact, they're low. How do you think, this is more of a psychological or strategic, is there been a shift in the industry's understanding of the power you wield and how to adapt differently? Like Toyota is phenomenal at that with its suppliers. I know Hyundai has been great at that, but I've witnessed others in the industry thinking wait a minute, this is how we do things, follow us, and it didn't work. Talk to us about that and how Toyota evolves, because you've been really great in that area.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't sit in the purchasing seat, and I would imagine those folks are very much more front and center in some of those discussions, and having to contend with the relative leverage as you talk about, considering where we stand in that market versus where we stand within some of the other components. This is obviously something, though, that's hit my radar recently, right? Just the awareness that we're in that position in terms of access to supply, and what do we need to do differently considering that, because I don't imagine that's going to change overnight.
Yeah, fair point. Robert, any thoughts on that? Or
yeah, I think what I touched on a little bit earlier is, just because we have this global, like Toyota, a global network of manufacturing operations, and therefore our chip supply can be from anywhere from of course, the U.S. and then the EU and Japan, China, Southeast Asia. And as Doug pointed out, I mean, the purchasing division builds those relationships, tries to make sure that we have the kind of supply that we need. But yes, with the growth of automobiles, whether it's autonomous, whether it's convenience of driving, lane keep assist, multifunction cameras, airbag control units, you name it, digital audio, the need is expanding. And so there is a need to have that industry partner with us to be able to grow the supply chain for the long haul. And that's what we're both, I'm sure, looking at. What can we do for the long haul to be able to sustain what the consumer wants in the near future?
Now, those are great answers. And I'll make a quick plug for KPMG and our listeners. We wrote a paper, it turned out to be quite prescient at the end of 2019, just before CES in 2020. And it's titled, for those of you who want to Google it, it's titled Automotive's New Ice Age. And it's a play on words from the internal combustion engine to the internal computing engine. And it's a paper exactly on this topic about the power and importance of semiconductors going forward. And as both Robert and Doug have alluded to, today it's about a $40 billion market. We believe it's going to grow to $200 billion going forward. And trust me, when you buy a computer today and you see the Intel inside, I don't know Intel's gross margins, but they're north of probably 60 to 65%. And I doubt the computer makers who make your PCs you're watching make anywhere near that. So there are incredible power struggles and differences strategically in this area. So if you're interested, we talk a lot of different strategies. Take a read on that if you're interested. So let me shift to a similar topic, and I'd love to get your points of view. So historically in the supply chain, King Ice, as we called it, the internal combustion engine, I'm going to get to that in a second, is diminishing in its stature. We'll talk about that. But in particular, as new electric vehicles become important, other commodities become important that historically have not been the case in automotive, like lithium and cobalt. Obviously, aluminum has been important, but it's one of the ingredients perhaps going into more battery electric. And you have to worry about obtaining magnets and rare earth minerals. How should the industry, we're right now seeing massive input prices increases. Heck, even steel prices are up significantly now. Maybe I'll start with you, Doug. How should we think about these other commodities strategically in the industry, which weren't as important and I think will be more important going forward? And what does this do for the supply chain strategically?
Yeah, I think historically we've had the luxury of maybe separating ourselves from that type of frontline raw materials acquisition or mining in some cases, right? But clearly, we all need to give a little bit more thought to that in the current and future environment. I think if I understand correctly, a lot of the shortages today are not necessarily specific to just the battery inputs you referenced, right? Lithium and rhodium and other things that are going into catalysts and the rest. So there's an overall raw material shortage and price increase challenge that we're all having to contend with. And that's not specific to one brand or another. The entire industry is wrestling with that. So to your question, I think we do have to give a little bit more strategic thought to where those are acquired, even if they're acquired somewhere down the supply chain, right? Are there enough provisions in place to make sure that the other folks we're depending on to have access to those have the access to the materials they need? Another part of that really goes into the accuracy of our forecasting, right? Are we collectively putting on the table an image of demand going out, 5-10 years over their planning horizon that's going to enable them to keep up? And if we're off the mark, what are the consequences of that, right? So pressure on those of us in a forecasting role.
No, that is a great point. I think, especially on the planning side, we talked that actually impacted on semiconductors. If you got that right, but now it's with these other commodities. I think that's a great point. I'll get to you in 1 second, Robert, because what he said to me was quite prescient and important, I think. So the industry, in terms of, first of all, you're all, quote unquote, fighting is the wrong word, but need the same raw materials, and you've got to be smart about that. Is there, obviously don't give me any of your Toyota secrets, but has there been a thoughtful, proactive way of differentiating your planning process? Has that evolved? is that something you're going to do, or where are you at in that? And where do you think the industry is on that?
I mean, I think if you look at anything that's being forecasted right now, there are huge ranges in outlook, right? You talk about electrification. What is that powertrain blend in 25, let alone 2030? So I think everyone's having to do a lot more scenario planning and plan around ranges, right? So do you have the headroom if things go to the upper side of things, and are you not in a bad position if things stay toward the lower end of your range? And I would say there's probably a lot more of that going on than there might have been 5 years ago, just because the degree of uncertainty is that much greater.
Great point. Well said. Robert, your thoughts in this area?
Well, I think what Doug touched on, just the overall product planning and the strategic plan that goes on within our organization when we look at the goals that have been set by our chairman, E.S. Chung, relative to electric vehicles and our Ionic brand, urban air mobility, which is a unique objective for us to be able to, and that's electric driven as well. And what we are doing as a company to say to our supply base and our supply chain, this is the strategy we have going forward. We need to partner to make sure we're prepared from every aspect to be able to achieve the objectives we have as an organization. And I think that's what's been great for us as an entity, that we've just laid out that roadmap. Yes, there's the potential highs and lows of where we might end up, but at least we've laid out the roadmap that says that we're going to have at least 44 green mobility vehicles in 2025. And that may be a mixture of hybrid, pure electric, or even certainly fuel cell with our Nexo vehicle.
No, yeah, and you guys both touched on it. It's this idea of planning and partnering with your suppliers, and how critical that is. I just have been in the industry, close to 20 years now, and I have seen a tremendous evolution, at least in my view, of the willingness of the automakers not only to partner, but to strategically figure out where to do that. The one area, though, that I continue to see, and it's really hard, especially when you're planning and making decisions under uncertainty. And I've studied a lot of decision making under uncertainty. But how do you get? I mean, you guys did quite well on the semiconductor decision, but culturally, getting it wrong has been very bad in the industry, and taking extraordinary risk is not something that the industry has leaned in on. But in some cases now with planning, and I guess, Doug, maybe I'm going back to what I asked you earlier. Is it okay, like Robert, you were saying, this is how we laid out our plan. Are you guys comfortable saying, okay, we may be wrong, but we'll compensate you, or we'll team together? Is there more of a sense of that going forward? Because we are dealing, as Doug said, with a great deal of ambiguity and uncertainty. Do you see that more evolving at Hyundai, or have you, or under E.S. Chung, or culturally?
Well, I think what I would probably best characterize it is, we've openly said what the investment strategy is going to be 2025, 2030. And though I'm not in the wheelhouse or within my scope of responsibility to be able to dictate what relationships we have with the supply base, I feel like those conversations might be taking place. And because there is, this long-term strategy that E.S. Chung has laid out, the chairman feels like this is where the company needs to be. And yeah, there are risks, but he's been a very forward thinker, and I think that's great for the company.
Very good. Let's shift a little bit here on the a similar topic, but quite a strategic topic. We're about to announce our next paper. It's going to be on the future of automotive powertrains, and just a little foreshadowing. Place your $1 billion bets wisely. This is big stakes, and these two venerable companies are placing bets in electric vehicles. They have ICE engines. They're fantastic also in hybrids, and now hydrogen fuel cells. Both are there. So let me start with a thesis, at least of our paper, and how you may react to it in terms of your strategy. I'll start with you, Doug. Our view is that the ICE powertrain, it's been king ICE, or my wife likes to say queen ICE here, for the last essentially 100 years, close to that. You can pretty much ultimately count on that you have to compete in so many different areas, but at least the internal combustion engine was the primary powertrain. And now that's not at all the case. In the next 5, 10 years, 20 years, you've got this mosaic is what we call it of powertrains. And so King Ice will diminish. How quickly and to what extent? And by the way, it is very complex because Europe may go faster, it looks like, than the rest of the world, or not. We shall see. Then the U.S. and you have China, which is the biggest market. You have India, which has 1.3 billion people, which most likely will be less, not as quick. And then you have Southeast Asia. I mean, there's 4 billion people on the planet. Essentially, even if they wanted to plug in today, couldn't reliably. And even in the rich United States, you can see what would happen. I mean, Doug, you were in Dallas, and Godspeed to everybody there. But what would have happened if everybody would have been 100% on the grid, and that was the only way to charge your car, right? You couldn't even go anywhere. I mean, from a national security perspective, from cyber risk, there's a lot of things to think about, and that's what we talk about in our paper. So my question to start off with you, Doug, Toyota has been very vocal in its brilliant technologies, even in, let's start with fuel cells and hydrogen fuel cells. You've invested a lot. You've got product out there. Where do you think you are in that? And what should we think about hydrogen going forward from a Toyota perspective?
Yeah, so we think fuel cells are one of 2 viable long-term zero-emission technologies, battery electric and fuel cell, and there are different use cases for both. And we think that's true in the light-duty market, and that's particularly true in the commercial market. So I think we tend to somehow get, mischaracterized as being against battery electric because we've put so much energy in the fuel cell, but we're really not. The reality, though, is the fuel cell does have a bigger task in infrastructure build out. And so, we've made good inroads in California, we've made good inroads in Europe and Japan, but the reality is we're not going to be able to jump to fuel cells overnight because we have some build out required over the course of the country. So again, we're still very optimistic. We're still positive. We're still investing heavily in that, both in the light duty and heavy duty space, but we really see a role for a portfolio of technologies. And honestly, I think that's a little bit of the concern right now as we feel like, regulators and NGOs and the rest are kind of looking for a technology winner. And we think that just the variety of use cases, we've got rural markets, we've got urban markets, we've got access to plugs, we have lack of access, we have cold markets, cold climate markets where battery range, suffers. What's the right formula? What's the right pathway? And I think we all agree we're heading toward a fully electrified future. We just have some differences in what that pathway looks like and what the best CO2 formula is to get there.
You're going to love our paper. Okay.
Good. Thank you.
I'll leave it at that. Robert, Hyundai has spent invested an incredible amount and been quite successful also in hydrogen fuel. So why don't you comment to that real quick also in your thoughts?
Yes. We have been, in a sense, in the fuel cell, innovation for many, many years. We've had partnerships in the U.S. that started out with just at the local level of municipalities in California to where now we are selling the Nexo fuel cell vehicle in California. And somewhat what Doug touched on is it's not just the fuel cell vehicle. It is going to the commercial vehicles because we already have a fuel cell semi-truck that we've been shown in the U.S. and is already in play in Korea. But we also look at it from generators. We look at it from even trains, even shipping vessels, for the fuel cell. So we see that as a bigger market beyond just the Nexo vehicle, which has done well in the U.S. market in California. But as he pointed out, the infrastructure is just not there in the U.S. But we know that the Biden administration has made it very clear about where he wants electric vehicles to go. And that involves whether battery electric and maybe even fuel cells. So there's opportunity there. But like Doug said, the timeline is going to be kind of interesting.
Yeah, and that is one of the things in our paper we talk about, because you may get the right strategy, but getting the timeline wrong, which is very easy, could be disastrous for you if you place big bets and you're even 5 years wrong or 3 years wrong, right? I mean, if depending on the bets you place. So I want to probe this a couple different scenarios and maybe have you react to this. So if King Ice continues, or Queen Ice, if my wife is listening, it continues to decline in its importance. Let's pick a number. If by 2030, 30% of the world is on pure battery electric, I won't guess what other fuel cell, whether it'll be hydrogen or hybrid, et cetera, but we'll just stick with that number. This will create quite a massive overcapacity, and we're gonna announce a number in our paper on this, but of production capacity that we have at least in 2021 to make ICE vehicles. There'll be an overproduction, which will cause. I mean, just keep the mathematics simple. If you reduce demand for this commodity by 30%, the entire ecosystem that's selling into there, the suppliers are going to have 30% less sales, all else equal. And this is a disruption we've really not seen at this scale in terms of the supply chain if this happens. And if it happens faster, it's going to be even bigger. It could happen slower. How should we think about your suppliers and your supply chain, given that this could really cause significant restructuring? Maybe we have time to restructure, and the hydrogen plants will go up, and the EV plants will go up. But governments today do not like it when you shut down assembly plants. I can tell you that, and companies don't like it when they're burning cash flows. So somewhere we got to figure this out. So maybe I'll start with you, Doug. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I mean, we start in-house. We have a lot of North American production facilities that build vehicles. They're currently tooled and equipped to build internal combustion engine vehicles. And Robert can speak to this a lot more intelligently than I can, but assembling a battery electric vehicle is a totally different game. But okay, we're not sitting and waiting for 2030 to suddenly start building 30% of our mix. We're starting to look at now, what do we need to do within our own production lines to start getting them ready for the flexibility to build a range of different technology vehicles. That's on the vehicle assembly side. We also have unit plants, right, that build transmissions and build engines here in North America, Alabama, West Virginia, Kentucky. We're having the same discussion there, right? What's the conversion process in our mind? Probably initially more to hybrid powertrains based on the volume we have in the U.S., but what's it going to take to conceivably be building, components or drivetrains for electric or electrified vehicles out toward that time horizon? And okay, that's our end of the process. Our suppliers are doing the same things. The folks who are forging engine blocks know that that may look different. What are they going to forge, right? Is it an inverter case? There's something that they need to evolve their vehicle to accommodate for this transition in technology. And again, I don't have complete insight into what's going on inside of all of those the suppliers, but I know that discussion is taking place down the supply chain and not just at the end manufacturer level.
No, great point. And American capitalism, or I should say global capitalism, is brilliant at adapting, and I absolutely have no doubt that will happen. But certainly we have never seen, essentially it's only been King Ice. So this is something new to the industry, and our view is, place your bets wisely, and place your bets wisely with your suppliers, because some of them are not going to be as adept and smart and clever, and there's probably going to be some restructuring and mergers or combinations and partnering. I think you lay that out really well, Doug, and I have no doubt both you and Hyundai will be certainly thinking and scenario planning a lot on this. Well, Robert, you're sitting there in the plant floor. How are you living with this right now in your near-term life, and how do you deal with all this?
Well, I agree with everything Doug said. Maybe one way of characterizing that, but within the context of short-term, long-term, we as an organization, have to change every time there's a model change. Yeah, it's still an ICE engine, but we still have to adapt and work with our suppliers on any kind of a change in our makeup of how the vehicle's been built, what components are part of it. So that's all about just that planning and working with those suppliers to be prepared for whatever the next vehicle may be. Because the mission at our plant is to be the best manufacturer of current and future mobility solutions. And so that's all of our objective. Whatever the product planning team out of Korea says that future mobility solution is going to be, we want to make sure it's being built right here in the United States in Alabama.
That's very good. Very good. Well, let's talk about staying on powertrains for a little bit. I'm curious, just maybe on a personal level and anecdotally and maybe strategically, the pesky consumer there. I mean, you can't make them buy this. Hybrids, Doug, you have phenomenal hybrids. You are a world leader in hybrids. They get terrific mileage. People are more used to them. And battery electric is different type of consumers, at least now. Maybe there'll be a tipping point. Then you have probably with 330 million Americans, I don't know how many drivers that would be, but, say 250 million potential drivers, you're going to have a big group that probably won't ever change. I know that's hard for the forecast, but how do you think about consumers in this and with your great technologies? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, you bring up a good point, because I think, unfortunately, in the whole policy, regulatory guideline, everything else discussion, we tend to lose sight of the customer. What's the customer ready to buy, and in what numbers, right? But I think we've been forced to do a little soul searching, even with a technology like hybrid, right? Hybrid, we have brought to market traditionally as a fuel economy solution with maybe some sacrifice in performance or acceleration, right? And that's worked for a Prius-oriented eco buyer. The reality is, if we're going to significantly expand the mix of those within our lineup, we got to come up with a few flavors. And I think we've seen some early success with that. The most recent RAV4 execution of the hybrid, it gets much better fuel economy, but it's actually faster and has better performance than the vehicle, than the conventional ICE model. And what we're discovering is more customers are willing to pay a premium for the acceleration than just for pure fuel economy. Okay, so which other products in the lineup does it make sense to go down that path? We've announced that by 2025, every vehicle in our global lineup will have an electrified option. What does an electrified Tundra look like? What does an electrified 4Runner look like? And what does that customer want versus that RAV4 customer, or what is that Prius customer? So we've really had to look at taking these technologies, to your point, with the customer in mind, and figuring out how do we diversify the appeal so that it meets the different interests of the different product segments, so we stand a chance of meeting some of our future mix goals.
Boy, you're going to like our paper again. I'm going to repeat this. So.
Good, I can't wait to read it.
We see the world very similarly on this. I mean, no one's talking about the consumer and really thinking about the consumer. You can't make people buy these products if it's not what they need them for, especially if it's more expensive. And, the energy density of gasoline is very difficult to beat. That's physics, right? And, Well,
I would also say in other markets, there are more carrots and sticks provided by the government in general. And we're not necessarily saying we're asking for those. But, in this market with low fuel prices, once you get a mandate, you're kind of hoping for the customer to come along, or the OEMs wind up being the shock absorber in the equation, which is just different than a lot of the other global markets.
Yeah, and that's what really makes this so different, because you're seeing in Europe big subsidies towards this, but Europe has big budget deficits, their economy. I mean, they're going to have some issues continuing doing that. And China, Doug, I'm sure you saw that, is they gave big incentives in the beginning, and then EV was doing well, and then all of a sudden they cut them off, and what did you see? They plummeted, right?
Yeah.
And without
or there's the other side, right? Access to the city center, right? The London tax structure, right? So in that case, it's not necessarily a subsidy coming the customer's way. There's a value that comes from part in connection with that technology, and you get something that you don't get with the other product, which helps steer customers in that direction. We've had that high occupancy vehicle lane access and those kinds of things, but they tend to sunset and be less generous.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think that goes back to, I just want to stay on this topic because I think it's so important. That's just the complexity of the world we're going to be living in, right? You could have the UK do that. You could have Paris decide to do, governments have a lot of power in this regard. But there's unintended consequences. I was reading, it's a great story. I guess is the beater car, is that an expression we can, so the $2,000 and less car in Europe all of a sudden exploded during COVID. Why? Well, everyone was, because public transportation transportation was so prevalent and so many people were afraid to do it, but they couldn't afford to buy an expensive car. So they bought these beater cars, these $2,000, $3,000 cars, which were terrible for the environment, by the way, but that's where the market went to. Instead of buying a new electric vehicle, this is where they shifted, which was a total unintended consequence of COVID. I don't know where it's at today. It's fascinating, right? It's fascinating how the consumer may or may not react to that. I'll bring you into this conversation, Robert. I know this is not necessarily in your span of control, but just maybe on a personal level, you're in Alabama, maybe in the Southeast. How do consumers think about electrified vehicles, your family?
Well, I think what I can offer, even from a Hyundai Motor Group point of view, is that we have the Ioniq brand, which is purely a battery electric vehicle that has an electric global modular platform that allow us to have a variety of vehicles that'll fit in this platform for pure electric. But like Doug said, we have that mix of hybrid solutions, plug-in hybrid solutions across our entire vehicle lineup. And I said earlier about by 2025 having 44 models with that a battery electric or a plug-in hybrid across the whole spectrum. So it is trying to set up where the consumer, when they're ready to make that transition to more of a clean mobility solution with any brand across the spectrum, that they have that choice. And yes, regulatory may drive some of it, fuel costs may drive some of it, but the key thing is just being prepared with something that the consumer wants to step into for the long haul.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I think as we continue as leaders, as all of us as leaders in the industry, I think we need to lead with the consumer in mind too, and remind everybody that that's really critical to success. If we really want to achieve climate success, we need to think about what is the incentive of a consumer to behave, to do that. So well stated on for both of you. Thank you. Let me switch a little bit topics, same topic, but this complexity in the supply chain and localization and tariffs and trade, and this is a complex world we live in here. So let's start off first, maybe closer to home. We have the MCA agreement. President Trump originally had a lot of tariffs in place, and we have a new administration with President Biden. I'm not sure what his trade policy is going to be yet. It's unclear yet. Maybe you can enlighten us on that. But how should we think about localization going forward with the supply chain? I know maybe I'll start with you, Robert, because you're in the front of it. You have to have just-in-time inventory, and if you don't got it, you're going to be shutting down that plant. How should we think about that? And then I'll go to you, Doug, more strategically on that.
Well, the way I would set it up is that Hyundai Motor Group has had a philosophy to build them where we sell them. And with our plant in particular, we have 35 to 38 just-in-time, just-in-sequence suppliers that, yes, are within a 60-mile radius of our facility. We have over 80 suppliers in North America, stretching, yes, from Canada to Mexico, and having that very, strong supply chain to support this facility, which do a little Chamber of Commerce for you. And we have over 3,000 team members, a $4.5 billion economic impact on the state of Alabama, which represents about 2% of the gross GDP of the state of Alabama. So significant. Wow. And yes, Toyota has a presence with their engine plant in North Alabama. There's Mercedes, there's Honda. So there are the automotive industry is critical. And what I would say relative really to your question, again, is just having the infrastructure here is important for the plant. And then, yes, you may make adjustments related to whatever trade agreements may be in place, but we're going to build them where we sell them. That's the key phrase for us.
Very good. Very interesting. So, Doug, maybe take us, obviously, you're a very global company, and you're one of the largest manufacturers in the United States, and for that matter, I'm sure in North America. How do you think about localization, all the complexities with geopolitics, tariffs, trades, duties, just supply chain? Walk us through your strategic thinking on that.
Yeah, so as with Hyundai, we have a philosophy of, build it where we sell it. Obviously, you need some scale to do that. You can't take your 10,000 unit niche vehicles and bring them all locally. But, we have made major investments. And honestly, when the whole discussion of USMCA came up, we were in the middle of a 5-year, $10 billion local investment plan. So I think that the challenge for us and the need for us is clarity and consistency. So the challenge in converting from NAFTA to USMCA is it's a whole different set of rules. We're still going to make the investments, but how we go about those investments now needs to change potentially significantly based on a new set of rules. So we're still within that 5-year plan. 10 billion is now 13 billion. But I will say we've had to go back to the drawing board and reorder or resequence some of the activities we were planning simply because we've been handed a new rule book. And I'm sure that's, maybe sounds like a mild inconvenience for those on the outside, but there's a lot of work in restructuring those plans and the rest. So,
I think it's a huge amount of work. I mean, we know it is. So maybe even elaborate that. I mean, that is a huge deal to have to deal with that.
It's just which vehicles you build where, which technologies you bring in when, simply because they are treated differently under the new set of rules. So again, we're supportive of USMCA because it does create a framework for free trade within North America. We're looking for those types of changes as infrequently as possible because we're a slow ship to turn. And it takes a little lead time to place those bets and actually get them to market.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, these are product decisions that you cannot get wrong at all in terms of what you bring in. Let me throw in this topic because it's so complex. One of the things, I'll go back to our paper on placing your billion-dollar bets wisely. And this is not a value judgment, what I'm about to say is, but as we all know, governments change. So we went from an Obama administration to a Trump administration to now a Biden administration. 4 years, we may have a new administration or in 8 years, right? I mean, who knows which party will win? You could have changes. How do you factor that in? I mean, again, no value judgment on what the future should be, but just the complexity now, because our political system seems a little polarized, if I could say the least. Trade. I mean, how does Toyota deal with that? Maybe Hyundai deal with that. This is a tough world to be a company to think about what politicians might do on the regulatory side.
Yeah, I'll just say that you have to be flexible. You have to be forward thinking, from a political point of view, but also from what you think is going to be, again, I'm going to go back to the consumer and what's going to make you value added for the consumer, make it efficient for you to build the vehicle and wherever you need to build it. Because we have 4 vehicles right now at our plant in Alabama. We'll have a 5th vehicle in June with the launch of the new Santa Cruz adventure utility vehicle. And that whole tariff, USMCA, all played a factor in what decisions we made on what vehicles we're going to make. So Elantra, Sonata, Santa Fe just launched the new Tucson, and like I said, Santa Cruz. So the company as a whole looks at where we can, build the vehicle, do it in an efficient and economic way, serve the North American market, because we export cars from Hyundai Motor Manufacturing Alabama into Mexico and into Canada. A little bit goes to Puerto Rico. We have even some going to El Salvador.
Wow. Doug?
Yeah, the only thing I would say, and I'm not sure this is completely on topic, but if there's one thing the recent supply disruptions have shown us is the global nature of the supply chain. When a tier 4 supplier in China suddenly has a COVID problem, like factories stop or can stop in the US. And I still remember you raised Fukushima a little bit earlier. I remember a couple of the Detroit companies having to stop painting cars in certain colors right after the tsunami because the pigments came from there, right? You just have no sense for how global the supply chain is. And so I think, at a time like this, with COVID, with this, freeze in Texas and the rest, it's when you need to be able to fall back on that global supply chain because something has happened locally you may need to go from Canada to Thailand to get that other source. And the more trade restrictions we have, it's not without consequences within the market. So I think that's the other thing to consider. Your question is sort of continuity. Yes, we have to build flexibility in as much as possible, but some of that flexibility needs to exist outside of our market because it's a global process.
No, it's spot on. And we in our pre-call we were talking about low probability, high impact events. We know something sometime in the next 5-10 years will happen, whether it's a tsunami or another, God forbid, pandemic or whatever. And having this flexibility into the supply chain is, I think, Doug's spot on. Has this just culturally within the organization? I know you are you wrote the book. I mean, you guys changed the automotive industry in terms of the just-in-time world-class manufacturing with, the Deming Award all the way to there. And have you rethought what buffer supply should mean and time? I mean, has it changed your Toyota manufacturing? I forget what you call it, the manufacturing way or however you say it.
Yeah, TPS, Toyota Production System. Yeah. We have hedges built in. We have risk management. We have multiple sources for various products. But I think as the last year has shown us, sometimes those risk strategies aren't going to work, right? I mean, I don't think we could have we have multiple suppliers for semiconductors. It didn't work, right? We've still suffered some of the challenges that everybody else has. So, I mean, I think that will force us to go back to the drawing board to some extent and say, how do those risk mitigation strategies need to change? Honestly, it may sound a little hypocritical coming from the just-in-time company, but some of our partners that did have a better buffer stock, are the ones that have been able to keep running. So I would imagine that may sneak into contracts, and the structure of things going forward is some kind of at least stipulation as to what that buffer stock should be, because I think we may have left a little bit too much of that up to the supply base in the recent round.
I agree. I actually think that is one thing that will change, because obviously an economic perspective is to drive that as efficiently as possible to mitigate risk, obviously get more optionality on that. But, we saw that. She's here now. My wife, if she hears me say this, but I'll give her credit. We are just in time at the Silberg household on a lot of goods. And as a background in economics, it pains me to see all the toilet paper and all that. We don't need to own Costco here, but it turns out, right, she was absolutely spot on. And really helped in our family just to have a buffer stock during this. And it was a wake-up call personally to our family, and I think to everybody, and I think to corporations, that to really, really think about that differently. And I would just add to that, just the cost of that, Doug and Robert, is the economic cost of carrying this weight versus the, your modeling and scenario, because our typical modeling says, get it aside, but, we don't realize if you, a low probability, high impact event, if you don't have that, like semis, you're going to shut down a plant at how many millions of dollars a day, right? Massive. And you'll lose that there versus here. One observation, if you'll permit me to make this comment here, one of the things I learned in economics and is that when you hedge on the financial markets, it's called covariance, right? You buy this, if this interest rates go up, bonds go down, or vice versa, right? Natural. But like gravity, when everything goes to hell, everything falls, and when covariance gets thrown out the door, and I think, it's words of wisdom with low probability, high impact events. I think that should be the rule of order and how to think about that, Doug. Robert, have you guys thought differently on your just-in-time? Is it a cultural change like Doug talked about, or thinking about it differently, or?
I think the organization is committed to doing what I think I heard Doug also say is redundancy in the supply chain when it's appropriate versus trying to upset the apple cart totally and not be able to continue to be an efficient operation. The way we look at it is trying to make sure that we've set up the commonality of parts on certain models, which allows us to, again, have this dual sourcing scenario. And then if one's having an issue, maybe the other isn't having an issue, so that we can continue to build the vehicles, but make sure, as I said early on, the product mix is set up right. So that was the main thing that we did early on, is just related to the product mix to adjust to the conditions that we were faced with the COVID shutdowns and the overall supply shortage of semiconductors. But it's been a challenge. I said that early on, and it continues to be. But I'm not in the product planning or purchasing group, so it's hard for me to be very specific.
Yeah, I understand that. Well, let's shift to you now, as we're getting close to the end of the hour. COVID, and you were on the front lines of the factory. I mean, talk about having to make it happen. What did you learn? If you had to do a do-over again, if you want to give yourself a gold star, where would you give it? Tell us, Robert.
Yeah, it's something we will never forget, because it's just really been about a year ago. On March 18, we had to shut down the plant, and because we had a COVID case in our plant, and so shut it down. All of the team members went home. We, as a leadership team, stayed on site and started looking at what could we do as an organization to prepare for when the day came that we could restart the plant. And it was everything you can think of, from high-touch, surface cleaning to barriers, plastic plexiglass barriers between stations, changing the workstation setup so the team members could work, changing the product flow so that the team members could work within the context of just-in-time sequencing of parts. Also cafeterias, break areas, everything, temperature screenings at the gates, everything we could think of within about a 6-week window. And we were able to start the plant up at the end of April safely. And we did one shift at a time and rotated between our 3 shifts. So A shift would come in 1 week, B shift, and C shift. And that allowed us to slowly but surely ramp up to where we had all 3 shifts on site. But that's what we were doing inside. But outside, we were also doing things within the community, which is very important to point out. We helped to acquire COVID-19 tests from Korea for the Montgomery and River Region area, as well as the entire United States. Spent about $4 million through our corporate foundation to be able to support drive-through testing throughout the U.S. Right here in Montgomery, Alabama, provided masks to first responders and emergency room personnel and COVID unit personnel. So there's so many things we did, not just internally, but also externally in the community, to be able to reinvigorate the economy, even a very, very tough time. And you said, well, we learned that we could do things if we hung in there together, and actually learned a lot from our friends in Korea as well, when they were slowly coming out of the COVID crisis there. So we had a little bit of some best practices. And we also shared those best practices with our suppliers, because the suppliers had to be able to start up too to support our operations. So it wasn't perfect, but we were able to get back on our feet and be able to build cars starting in late April, early May of 2020.
Bravo. Doug, Toyota did a terrific job too, and you have a lot also to be proud of. Any thoughts from you on Toyota during the crisis?
No, similar story. I got to read about it. Robert had to live it, so I'm not going to put myself in his category. But I do think I'm very proud of the accommodations we were able to make within the plants to have the team members feel safe going to work every day. We've done a ton of on-site testing, and likewise tried to reach out into both the supplier community to help them get back on their feet, and within the community itself. We've got Toyota production specialists working with FEMA on how to quickly do vaccinations right now. So what are the skills we can bring beyond just building shields and masks and the rest that can just help the overall process? And so proud of what we've done there. Obviously, I sit in more of a desk environment. We're all work from home, as I know your team is, and looking at what lessons we learned from this as we go back to the office, clearly in a very different way than we left. So hopefully some advantages both from productivity and just team member satisfaction with work-life balance and the rest.
Have you thought about? Oh, go ahead.
I'll just add one more thing, just because it's been very interesting dynamic. Is now we're in the vaccine stage. And we were very fortunate to be able to work with Alabama State University, historically black college and university right here in Montgomery, Alabama, to vaccinate our team members. In fact, tomorrow we'll have about 1,000 folks being vaccinated to help us continue to be able to do our production of vehicles in a very safe way day in and day out. So that was just a great partnership with the local university.
Bravo, bravo. Just back to you real quick, Doug. Have you at Toyota, from a salaried workforce, have you thought about how you in Plano are going to get back, and is it going to be hybrid? Are you going to go back to California a little bit and do some surfing? I don't know if you were a surfer. I don't know.
No, we did have some folks return to the places they came from, whether that was Kentucky or Michigan or New York or California. But we have asked those folks to make their way back. We're expecting that the vast majority of our team will still live within a reasonable proximity of their place of work. Right now, the company's offering a lot of discretion, kind of work group by work group. What should it look like for you? When and how do you come back? But quite honestly, right now, there's still temperature checks coming in the buildings. There's one person per elevator. There's social distancing and masks. So I don't know that we're necessarily on the cusp of that, but everybody's clearly starting to strategize on what should this look like when all of those restrictions are gone, and what's the reasonable balance between networking and face-to-face connections and the flexibility of working from home.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think all of us, even at KPMG, we're doing a lot of thinking about us and serving you both as great clients and just our staff. And it's a tricky question right now. So I think we'll all look to ourselves in this area and leaders and thinking about that. I'm sure we'll come to a really good answer. But I know it will be different, by the way. It'll be from what before. I think my personal view is it'll be somewhat of a hybrid more than it ever has been, just like powertrain, just different. And I think could be actually good for those who figure out how to do this right. You can get phenomenal talent and do it in a different way that we didn't think we could before. But you still got to build the Toyota culture. I have a feeling, in the Hyundai culture, and I can tell you the KPMG culture, we need to be together to do that. You can't build it like this. So I'm sure all of us will eventually figure this out. Last question. We're down to a few minutes left. Just words of wisdom. I'm an optimist. So if you don't mind, could you give me your most optimistic, just think 5-10 years from now, what do you think? Optimistic, you can pick any topic, our industry, whatever. What do you think is going to happen? We're going to have more vaccine. I mean, I'll start with you, Doug. I put you on the spot. Give me something optimistic and all of our listeners now going forward.
Well, I you've talked about this transition to electrification. I think we're going to make some significant inroads. Again, we got a range of outlooks on where we're going to land by that point, but I think there's going to be progress. I think we're going to have more fuel efficient vehicles out there and a range of options, and I think it's going to be good for those consumers we keep trying to focus on.
Amen to that. Robert?
Yeah, I'll even dovetail off that in the sense of optimism, because whether it's the Toyota brand or the Hyundai brand, being able to address the range anxiety of the consumer, whether it be with the battery electric vehicle or with our fuel cell technology, is going to help them transition. So I'm optimistic, like Doug, that in time, whether it's 5-10 years down the road, that the consumer is going to be very pleased with the performance and the capabilities of the electric vehicle in the future.
Excellent. And on that note, I'll just tell you, I'm incredibly optimistic about our industry. And why wouldn't you be after listening to these two fantastic gentlemen talk about our future? Thank you both for taking your time. Thank you for all the listeners out there. It was super fun to hang out with you for an hour. I wish we could have been together, but hopefully very soon. So all the best. Stay safe, everybody, and take care. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thanks, Gary.